Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. Hello, I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, historian and independent researcher, and I'll be your host. Today's podcast episode will explore the issue of the climate industrial complex, its campaign to destroy the hydrocarbon industry in the Western world, and the net zero transition. My guest today will be Rupert Darwall, a senior fellow of the Real Clear Foundation. Never before in the history of humanity have so many people in the world been lifted out of poverty to live longer and to live so well on a greener, cleaner planet. We are living in a time of unprecedented prosperity, particularly in the Western world. This prosperity can be attributed to the proliferating use of hydrocarbons, facilitated by the rise of market economies and core Western values of individual freedoms, property rights, and the rule of law. However, all of these things that allow for greater prosperity have been under assault for some time and are being eroded to the point of collapse. The latest rationale for revolution is climate change. There is a transnational or global progressive movement to enable a fundamental paradigm shift, a great transformation, and the climate industrial complex is a key component of this movement. The goal is to transform the entire global system through a net zero transition and ESG scores. The hydrocarbon production and consumption in the Western developed countries will be terminated. Although there are differences amongst the various groups and networks within the movement, they do agree on the ultimate goal of ending capitalism and our modern way of life. Our system will then transition to a technocratic, decarbonized, net zero civilization. The conundrum for the movement was how to terminate hydrocarbon production in the West. Government regulations are one method, litigation is another. But another way has been to try and divert private investment away from hydrocarbons to essentially kill the private petroleum and coal sectors. To that end, the support of the financial industry and the public has been cultivated for more than a decade. Financial institutions are now pressuring companies and investors to toe the ESG line, which voluntarily compels divestment from companies that aren't green or inclusive enough. Investments will be diverted into progressive approved initiatives like the green economy. Global mandatory rules are set to be negotiated in September before the COP26 meetings in Glasgow in November. It won't be long before this trickles down to individual citizens, where every action and decision will be measured based on ESG scores and perhaps even a person's carbon score, something very similar to the social credit system operating in China. This compulsory energy transition means reducing global human carbon dioxide emissions to zero or net zero. It is a self-destructive move from a system of efficiency and reliability to the exact opposite. A sudden and significant drop in our living standard is a requirement to get to zero emissions. The sellers of net zero do not convey the likelihood of human suffering it will bring in its wake. The costs of net zero to our civilization and humanity are too high, and the benefits of hydrocarbons to human flourishing need to be considered. Our current system may not be perfect, but it has improved the care of our environment and planet and people, unlike any others. This is a system worth restoring and fighting for. Today I'll be speaking with Rupert Darwall on the issue of the climate industrial complex, its campaign to destroy the hydrocarbon industry in the Western world, and the net zero transition. Rupert is a senior fellow of the Real Clear Foundation, researching issues of energy and environmental policy and corporate governance. He previously worked as an investment analyst and in corporate finance, as well as serving as a special advisor to the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer. Rupert has written numerous think tank reports, articles for the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, the Daily Telegraph UK, among others. He is also the author of two fantastic books, The Age of Global Warming and Green Tyranny. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today, Rupert.
It's my pleasure, Tammy.
You have quite a diverse background, and for those who are unfamiliar with your work, can you just give a brief explanation of what led you to this issue, to examine the environmental movement in all of its complexity and nuance?
Yeah, it came about because I met an economist I'd only previously heard give the Reith lectures, which he'd done in the mid-1980s, I think. and his name is David Henderson, and he was a former OECD chief economist. He'd worked at the World Bank. He was also he taught economics at Oxford, and I met him at a lunch, in fact, at the Institute for Economic Affairs, and we talked about environmental regulations, environmentalism, corporate social responsibility, and it really developed from there. And my first book, The Age of Global Warming, was in essence, it was kind of inspired by him and also the terrain it covered, in particular things like the Rio Earth Summit, the Brundtland Report, the Brandt Report, and the doctrine of sustainable development. These were things he'd been mulling over, and so that's what really set me on the path. And it came about really because he'd worked me up so much that I felt the only thing I could do was actually write a book about it. And so that's how I got involved. It was an accident, as it were, Tammy.
It's funny how those accidents happen. Just a passing conversation almost, and it can inspire investigation into different issues and whatnot. I really liked how in Age of Global Warming, how you showed that history, that development, because I'm sure once you start looking, for example, at the Sustainable Development Doctrine, and then you start going backwards, well, where did this come from? And you keep going farther and farther back until it's like, okay, well, I have to start over here and put things forward. And then it was really good how in Green Tyranny you moved forward to a more specific focus. And I quite enjoyed how you how can I explain it? Where you talk about the Nazi roots to the IPCC and the proposed global framework for governing emissions and all this massive change that it must lead to for our standard of living in the Western world. And I think a lot of people weren't aware of those connections and links through the Germans and the Nazi movement and how they were so environmental and how this just has echoes. And then you talk about Sweden and you talk about Germany and, of course, the Germany's energy plan and how terrible that is.
Yes, I think there were two legs in Green Tyranny. There were two legs. First of all, there's the Swedish end of the story, and it's really very, very interesting how this quite not very large country, but an incredibly influential country, put environmentalism on the map and on the international agenda. And it's not an accident that the first UN conference on the environment, big one anyway, was held in 1972 in Stockholm. That's what the Swedes did, and the agenda there was really quite straightforward. They wanted to build a string of nuclear power stations. Sweden does not have coal, so it used coal as if you like, as a straw man to say if you don't have nuclear, you're going to have coal, and coal does two things. It causes acid rain, which means our lakes will die, the forests will die, and so forth. And then it got on within 2 years. It then switched to global warming as the main effect of coal. And so they did build their nuclear power stations, but the Swedish Social Democrats, which had ruled Sweden almost unbroken back to before the Second World War, actually lost power because of the nuclear program. And on Germany and the Nazis, I think this is something to do. This is a very important aspect of environmentalism, because a lot of environmental thought, philosophy, the ideas comes out of Germany, and Germany is a very almost bipolar in that its power in Europe comes from industry, from industrialization. On the other hand, there's a big strain in German thinking and culture that is very hostile to industrialization, the belief in the German forests and being close to nature and all that kind of stuff. And you get that that was very prominent in Nazi thought. And the importance of that wasn't just a sort of historical episode of kind of interest only to historians, because what then happened was in the 1970s, the Social Democrats in Germany also wanted to have a big nuclear power program, and there was a spontaneous popular movement against nuclear power stations. And out of that, you had the Greens forming. They were formed at the beginning of 1980. And who were the Greens? Well, they were composed of ex-Nazis. An ex-Nazi actually designed the green logo, neo-Nazis, and far leftists, the post-Marxists of the Frankfurt School, some of whom became terrorists, but others became like Joschka Fischer, became leaders of the Green movement. And that the greening of German politics led to the greening of European politics. It has had a huge, huge impact. And you can see that because the Greens still remain anti-nuclear. You'd have thought in a rational world, the response, as the Swedes got it, the rational response to global warming and carbon dioxide emissions would be to build lots of nuclear power stations. But the one thing the Greens hate even more than global warming, much more in fact, is nuclear power. And around, whether it's in Germany, Belgium, in California and New York, you see green activists campaigning to close nuclear power stations, and they've been successful in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was at a conference in Germany in 2011, and it was just after, I think it was about 6 months after Fukushima, and there was an activist who came to the conference. I guess he was just an observer, and he had a freak out because people were talking about if we want to pursue renewables, they're not enough, and nuclear is something we ought to explore further and perhaps develop more. And he went on this huge rant for about 15 minutes. He stood up amongst everybody and was going on and on about how when it crashes, it kills everybody, and the ground is, he was just so emotional that there was no real rational argument there. It was just pure emotion. And I find that people don't know how to deal with these emotional arguments. And I know that the Greens or the extreme environmentalists use that emotion to get public sympathy and to convince politicians that people are riled up about something, and then in order to push a policy change. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with you that this is irrational. The Greens' hatred of nuclear power has no basis in rationality. I think it has to be understood on a philosophical level, and that is that they view nuclear power as, well, you remember the myth of Prometheus in Greek mythology, of stealing fire for the benefit of mankind. And what nuclear power is mankind, is humanity delving into the deepest secrets of nature to release limitless energy for humanity's benefit. And to environmentalists, that is the greatest crime of all. That is, if you like, that is why they oppose it. It is completely non-rational. I mean, but it is to do with philosophy, and I think German philosophy is fundamentally irrational. And actually, where I got to writing Green Tyranny and then looking at the Nazi antecedents, it's also ultimately it's nihilistic. It's
Yes.
destructive.
Yeah. And anti-human.
Correct. Absolutely. And anti-civilizational.
Yes. It's like we're all supposed to go back to being a hunter. Well, not even a hunter-gatherer, I guess just a gatherer, and living in off the land and whatnot. And you see that also in the trends, for example, with the EU Green Deal and its farm to fork strategy and their biodiversity plan. It's all about changing how we do agriculture to go back to peasant farming, which I find just reprehensible. About the people, they prefer people to starve than do proper farming.
Yes, so you can see with coal-fired power stations, nuclear power stations, this is industrial scale energy generation. And what the Greens like is, and the words give it away, are wind farms and solar farms. So we farm the energy that the sun gives us, kind of thing. Again, this is irrational, but it is to do with this weird, deep German idealistic. I use the idealistic in this philosophical sense, philosophy, and it is. There is, again, in my view, there is no rational basis for wind and solar, particularly solar in Western Europe. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense. But the reason it's there is because of the German Greens. And again, in Green Tyranny, I show that actually the Nazis, in complete accordance with this philosophy, were the first political party anywhere in the world to campaign on a platform of wind power. They wanted renewables, and they did that in the 1933 Reichstag elections. So I think it's very important to understand the reason why we've ended up with wind and solar is not because of the superiority of this technology, because it's inferior. It requires masses. It requires a mass land take is one thing, which is why it's bad. But fundamentally, it is demand unresponsive. But environmentalists like that because it means that we have to live our lives at the whim of nature. And when the wind blows and the sun shines, nature is bountiful to us, and when it doesn't, well, we're stuffed. And that's living in accordance with the rhythms and harmonies of nature. Take it for what you will.
Right. And I find that so, like I said before, anti-human, because for all of humanity, we've been fighting against nature, or at least pushing back to survive it. And I think it was Alex Epstein had a really good point where he said, hydrocarbons make us safe from climate, makes us safe from weather, because we build shelters, we try to find ways to sort of defend ourselves against these unpredictability elements of nature. And it's kind of interesting that their position is to live at the whim of nature.
Yes, I think one has to just make a distinction between nature conservation and the preservation of beautiful landscapes, of wildlife habitats and so forth, and environmentalism. Because environmentalism is not about preserving nature, because it's covering nature in wind farms that, as we know, kill enormous amounts of wildlife, particular raptors at the top of the food chain. It kills bats by the hundreds of thousands. So this is not about preserving nature. It's about changing our civilization. And that's an incredibly important difference to understand. The environmentalism is not about nature conservation. It grew out of that movement, but it's fundamentally different from it.
Right. I completely agree. And I really liked how in your book you talk about how there was the conservation movement and how it was rather hijacked by these others. And with respect to the windmills, there was a study a few years ago out of Germany where a German engineer in one of the states was asked to examine why the windmill efficiency dropped so quickly after they were installed. They didn't understand what was going on. They thought, okay, is there ball bearing wearings or wearing out, or what was happening? So he went and investigated the windmills and found that they were just layered with coats of dead bugs, dead insects. And so he extrapolated out and did a study. He talked to some of the people who specialize in the migratory routes of insects, which people don't really understand happens. And he found that where the windmills were, they channeled the air through these migratory paths of the insects, and the insects were annihilated on the blades of the windmills. And he put in his report that based on his calculations, that it's quite likely that the German windmills are responsible for the insect apocalypse in Europe, because the way the insects move through Germany to go to these other places, and the EU, the government, the officials were blaming farming, which is why they want to reduce the amount of insecticide and fertilizer and all this other stuff for farming. And that report got zero response.
Well, so the biggest insecticide is actually wind farms. That's very interesting.
Yes,
and of course that then, you go up the food chain to birds and so forth. It has a huge impact on wildlife.
A complete knock-on effect. So you wipe out the insects, which are the food for the birds, but you're also killing the birds, and you're killing the bats that also, eat the insects and so on. And it's just, and the raptors, and And people always put up that false argument, the false analogy of, oh, well, your cat kills more birds than windmills. But, cats are killing little birds that have many babies, throughout the year or
Yeah,
whatever.
I call that the George Floyd fallacy, that because because more there are more black on black murders, it doesn't matter if a policeman shoots a black man or kills a black man, and that is the moral equivalent. I mean, I shouldn't compare human life to animal life, but you get the point of the comparison. Just because cats kill birds, it doesn't mean that it's okay for windmills to wipe out raptors.
Exactly. So I kind of would like to ask you, because green tyranny, one of the subtitles is about the climate industrial complex. So can you explain what to you is the climate industrial complex?
Yeah, I'll do it. I think the place to start, in a way, is with Maurice Strong, who was a Canadian who was instrumental in the UN Stockholm Conference and then the Rio Earth Conference Summit 20 years later in 1992. And he died shortly before the Paris conference, Climate Conference 2015. And there was a small sort of colloquium held at the conference, which I attended, of former colleagues and so forth of his. And one of his colleagues uh, said about he was at the Stockholm conference and he asked Maurice Strong, what is the policy of the conference? And Strong's reply was, the process is the policy. And you think, well, what does that actually mean? And I'll tell you what it means. It's that the process accretes influence and spreads networks and sucks people, power, and money into it. And so you have these UN conferences, and then you have the IPCC, and you have the whole you have academics and scientists who hang off the IPCC, and you have you have bureaucrats working at the environmental agencies and environmental ministries. So that's, if you like, the core. And then, of course, you get the rent seekers in the renewable industry, and then you've got academics who study energy and who are who are signed up to renewables and essentially, produce these papers. And then you have bankers who finance the stuff, and it just grows and grows and grows. And at the Madrid Climate Conference, there was a fairly new addition, which was finance ministers. Finance ministers are being drawn into this. So then you get the finance ministers G7 in Cornwall, which says climate change and diversity should be at the core of every economic decision we make. And so you get this process of accretion, so that kind of you get more. The one I haven't mentioned, of course, is the media. The media are incredibly important in the climate industrial complex. You've got environmental reporters, but now you've got papers like the Financial Times, which are openly pursuing the climate agenda, and all it's kind of this huge ecosystem that feeds off climate change and projects it and propels it.
Well, I find the use of that terminology very helpful, the climate industrial complex. And the way I look at it is that there's that component is part of this larger movement, because when I call it a transnational progressive movement, I do so because of the political dimensions and the seemingly lack of a clear, direct leadership, as would be implied with a complex. Like, there's no evident CEO of the movement, and the movement is fluid. And like you said, there's different groups and networks who they're working somewhat independently, but they have this common goal to undermine and overthrow the system. So there's this diversity of I would almost say ideology, but I'm not quite sure about that, because there's lots of fellow travelers. You have the Marxists, you have the Jacobins, the new Jacobins or whatever. You've got the environmental groups, and even within the environmental groups, there's different philosophical viewpoints and so on. And I think it's really important to show, and you inspired me a lot, that it's this diverse conglomeration, really, but they're moving, and it's fluid, and it's three-dimensional, and it's very hard, I think, for us to try and imagine how it operates when there's all of these different networks from, coming in from all these
Yes.
different angles.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, what I didn't mention you should have done were the NGOs. And
Right.
one of Maurice Strong's sort of genius things was to invite the NGOs to the 1972 Stockholm Conference. He knew exactly what he was doing, that you co-opt the NGOs, and then they go back to their countries, and they put pressure on their governments. And of course, then the governments are actually often financing the NGOs. And of course, the other thing you've got are the multi-billion dollar foundations,
The
the Rockefellers,
foundations, yeah.
particularly from the US, and fluid is the right word. I think it's a big mistake to talk about conspiracy or sort of there's some kind of guiding intelligence to it. There's a kind of inner logic, but
Right.
it's a sort of, if you like, it's ideological rather than there's not a controlling mind that directs this. And I always push back when people suggest conspiracy. It's much more interesting than the conspiracy.
Exactly. And you mentioned the IPCC, and and you say that their direct statement is that it's an intentional societal transformation. And so then it becomes a matter of, why are these types of declarations, like that of the IPCC or the World Economic Forum's Great Reset, why are they not taken seriously?
Yes, I think it's because environmentalism is an ideology in the same way that Marxism is an ideology, and yet it's not perceived as such. I mean, if someone comes up, if there's someone who's a Marxist journalist or a Marxist economist, you know exactly where they're coming from. But environmentalism, because it's confused with nature conservation, it gets kind of a free pass. That's worrying. But then you look at this, if you then compare Marxism and environmentalism, in a way they're opposites, because Marxism was about changing the ownership of the means of production. On the other hand, environmentalism is about changing the means of production themselves. But, and tell me, this is the really important point, preserving the existing power structures and wealth and distribution of wealth in society. I mean, clearly there are extreme environmentalists who want to have, but why is Prince Charles an environmentalist? Why is the heir to the British throne an environmentalist? Why is Bill Gates an environmentalist? Or Larry Fink, a CEO of the world's largest fund manager? He is an environmentalist. It's about environmentalism preserves the existing power structure. So because it's not politically revolutionary, people they don't really see it as an ideology, but it is an ideology. And as I suggest, it's in some ways, it's a more radical ideology in that it wants to overthrow the existing means of production, particularly when it comes to hydrocarbons. And so it has a greater bearing on our lives than just expropriating shareholders. Do you see?
Yes, for sure. And I think that's a very excellent way of describing it. And I was thinking, when you look at environmentalism as an ideology, because part of the problem is that they're always trying to redefine things, or if you say, well, I think you're more like a new feudalism, or like Joel Corton explains in his book, or you're more like a neo-Marxist, they'll say, no, that's not it at all. And I think it's intentional to not have a specific understanding of it, because then it's easier to deflect, right? Because whenever an accusation is made, and I think that's part of how we think, we try to compartmentalize things, we try to pigeonhole things to simplify, but in oversimplification, then we miss stuff. And it's also allows the movement or the environmentalism as an ideology to say, no, that's not it. We're not like this at all.
I think that's part of it. But the other reason, and this is where it differs from Marxism, is there aren't the foundational texts. So with Marxism, it's the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, and then the writings of Friedrich Engels and so forth. In environmentalism, there isn't that same corpus of work where you can point to a canon of environmentalist thinking, which is quite rigidly adhered to and interpreted. I mean, I think there are important texts. For the preeminent one, I think, is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which I would argue, is the single most important book of the second half of the 20th century. I mean, I think it had a huge impact in the United States. And incidentally, its most famous chapter, which I think is called 1 in 4, I mean, which is about, it's the cancer chapter. And there are sentences about swimming in seas of carcinogens. Excuse me. And that, her view that modern industrialized society is essentially producing carcinogens, it came directly from Nazi medicine. So there's a very important link there. And the environmental movement to this day basically believes that the products of industrial society cause cancer, whereas the two big things that call carcinogens have been the humble tobacco leaf and asbestos, essentially. But so there isn't, I think, with environmentalism, I mean, going back, the word you use is very good. It's much more fluid, and it's not bound rigidly to a set of canonical texts in the way that Marxism is.
Absolutely. But I would like just a little clarification, because you say that, and I agree to some extent, that it's about preserving the existing power structure. But part of the existing power structure allows for a large middle class. And I think that they're trying to get rid of that middle class, keep the elites as having power, maybe solidify or, keep the elite power while diminishing those beneath them. So I don't know is there another way to perhaps describe that?
I completely agree. I completely agree with that. I mean, it's about, power structure is about, Joel Kotkin talks about the clerisy, and so you've got if you like, that intellectual class, but you also have Wall Street, you have the social media on the other coast, and you've got entertainment in Hollywood. So you've got I completely buy, and it's about hollowing out the middle. That's absolutely true. So if you like, the middle class, and middle America. You're absolutely right. They are the big losers, as are what used to be known as the labour aristocracy of the high value add, high wage, blue collar of mining, steel making, oil and gas. I mean, it's a little known fact that the highest, if you look at, people talk about Britain's productivity problem, which is measured in gross value added. GVA, and the city region outside London with the highest GVA in the United Kingdom is Aberdeen. And why is that? It's to do with oil. And people in the oil industry are paid very well. Those jobs are going. So it's not just the middle class. It's the labour aristocracy that's going to be evicted from their livelihoods, and will going to spend the rest of their working lives cleaning solar panels.
Right. I agree completely with that. I just want to kind of bring it to the role of technocracy, because I think that it's these sort of elite scientists, and we're supposed to trust the science. And Mark Carney states repeatedly, what gets measured gets managed. And I keep thinking, we'll all be managed, because every action and decision we make is going to be measured. And we're told that this ESG criteria or the taxonomies will be based on science. But what science? Which science? Who's deciding what that science is? Who's going to arbitrate it? And is it going to be a scientific but appointed carbon council, like what Mark Carney proposes? How does one get chosen to be on this council? So What is the
I
role
think
of?
what Carney points to is that with net zero, um, the organizing principle of society and economy is that every activity is organized around this objective. And so as you suggest, it touches every aspect of life. And yeah, there's there's a sort of technocratic overlay about it, and it puts the carbon bean counters in a well, we've had COVID and we know about Sage modelers and stuff like that running our lives. In the net zero world, we'll have the climate equivalent of Sage. Well, we got it with the Committee on Climate Change, chaired by Lord Deben. But they will be the new people, this technocracy that will be running our lives, and the job of politicians will be essentially to implement what these people say.
So what I was going to say is with respect to Carney, he had co-wrote a report in the autumn with Janet Yellen and some of these other former central bankers or something, and they mentioned the carbon councils, but then they also said it's really important to cultivate support on both sides of the aisle, so that regardless of who's elected, the policies will remain the same. So then it becomes a matter of, well, what's the point of having an election if the policies aren't going to change?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, because these are policies for the next 3 decades, not the next 2 election cycles,
Right.
and they've got to enact them. It means that decarbonisation, which is the organising principle of society, has to be put beyond politics. So voters can't change the decision that has been taken for them. That's absolutely right.
Right.
It's why the European Union is better at this kind of thing, with its sort of essentially post-democratic or mixed system, if you wanted to be not rude, of governance. Why the European Union is better at this kind of thing.
Yeah. Um, so talking about science and technocracy and models, is the IPCC about science? And what do you make of the IPCC climate projections, their models, and the so-called carbon budget?
The carbon budget is essentially made up, and it's worth recalling that the Paris Agreement, lumbered the world with a 1.5 degree. It's the first text where 1.5 got in, but it was more as an aspiration, and net zero was talked about happening in the second half of this century. The IPCC then came along with its net zero report and redefined 1.5 degrees as a limit rather than an aspiration, and it brought forward the date for reaching net zero from the second half of the century to the mid to 2050. And you quoted what it said in there about net zero offering the opportunity for societal transformation. It is one of the great things that is not understood about the IPCC and climate science in general, and environmentalism, is it's got a layer of science to it, but there's also a layer of ideology. And again, this is the similarity with Marxism. There's a layer of science, there's a layer of economics, but there's a big fat layer of ideology. And the two are very difficult to pull apart. And you see that in the IPCC report time and time again. And I think the net zero report was far and away the most overtly ideological report yet produced by the IPCC. And again, there's no national government that said, we're not going along with this because it's tainted by bias and ideology. They just they're blind to it. They just swallow it. It's partly because we're all environmentalists now. The ideology, I think one of the things one has to accept is that environmentalism is the most powerful ideology in the Western world. I mean, people talk about neoliberalism, forget that. It's environmentalism defines what is the mainstream in Western countries now.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think people don't see it that way, until people see what's happening or understand then it's very difficult to sort of push back or fight back. You make an excellent observation in Climate News, and I've just pulled up the quote here. And you said, the IPCC does not offer any evidence that humans, or for that matter, the planet, would be better off if average temperatures were 1 degree lower. And I thought that was just so good, because it's like what Bjorn Lomborg often points out, that there's a failure of a true cost-benefit analysis of these policy options. Like, what makes them think that having a cooler planet will be better?
Yeah, there is, and in fact, because right from the start, it's been very, very difficult for the climate industrial complex to demonstrate that decarbonising is worth the benefit. So what they've always postulated is there's a catastrophe. There's going to be some kind of negative transformational change. It might be tipping points, or it might be these various things, the West Antarctic ice sheet disappearing in a matter of years, and sea level rise, all that kind of stuff. And so they have to hypothesize that there are these catastrophic tipping points, and to free themselves of the need to demonstrate that actually the costs are less than the benefits. And so the IPCC, that report does not, it actually says it doesn't offer a cost benefit analysis. It does indicate some shadow carbon prices to reach net zero, which are absolutely eye-watering. They go up to, I think for 2050, I'll just look, these numbers are so enormous that one kind of forgets how, tens of thousands of dollars per ton, which is just, yeah, it's so in the, mid-century, the 1.5 pathway, you've got a shadow cost of carbon of $14,300 a ton. And
Oh my God.
CO2 is a ubiquitous gas that is produced naturally, as we know. I mean, 95% of it is natural. It comes from agriculture and so forth. I mean, it is just, you read it, it's the lack of common sense. And this stuff is crazy, to talk about something like that being, okay, a carbon tax of $50 a ton. Okay, that's reasonable. You can think, well, but when you're talking about thousands of dollars a ton, this is insanity.
And it will only be applied to people in the developed countries.
Well, that's the other thing that's not taken account of, is that Western emissions are now just over a quarter of global emissions. So what we do doesn't really matter. And this is something that just hasn't, the penny hasn't dropped on it. And it won't drop on it, because environmentalism, I think that the secret with this stuff, Tammy, what the conclusion I came to, is that fundamentally it's not about global warming. Because
Exactly.
if it was about global warming, we'd have nuclear power and we'd have a $50 carbon tax and kind of job done. But it's not about that. It's about transforming society. The IPCC let the cat out of that. That is fundamentally what it's about. And the global warming is a means to an end. It's a means to an ideological end.
Yeah. Absolutely. I totally agree. That's what I've seen. And I'll give you another example of why it's not about emissions, because they were all about, we need to do carbon capture, and we need to do find a way to suck it out of the air or whatever. So there was a Carbon X Prize, and these guys they won the prize. They developed a way where they can take the carbon dioxide or the emissions from a coal power plant or a natural gas plant, and they can take those emissions and turn it into concrete, make cindercrete blocks. And I was on this webinar and I heard these guys talking. And so they were asked, what sort of carbon tax would you need in order to make this profitable? And they said, we don't need any, because we just go to the power plant, we take the emissions, we turn it into cindercrete blocks, which we sell. And yet here there was a group of environmentalists who wrote a letter to the Biden administration saying that carbon capture should not be in the whatever climate plan they want to do. So if you could find a way to negate the emissions, to cancel them out and have net zero, would the environmentalists stop with this nonsense? Would they still let you drive your car if you could find a way
That's
to,
right.
they wouldn't. I don't think they would.
No, they would find thousands of reasons why the technology wouldn't work and blah, blah, blah. No, that's absolutely right. A fix for it is the last thing the environmentalism wants, because then they would, their great, their biggest, it's what Pascal Bruckner, the French philosopher, says, that the future's once again become the great category of blackmail. It's a form of blackmail. And of course, if you then say, well, actually, there's a very cheap, quick, easy way of sorting this out, of course they don't want it sorted out.
That's right. And we've seen that in the oil sands in Canada. So when they were complaining about the mining and the tailings ponds and all that sort of thing, the companies invested more into the steam-assisted gravity drainage, so the SAGD. Then the environmentalists put out these, they do these little press releases and these little info documents or whatever, and they were distributing them around. And I saw these when I was in Europe. It's still not good. The emissions are still really high. This is really bad. So every time that the environmentalists set a bar, the industry meets and exceeds that bar, then they move it again. And it's always a ratchet. And the companies, I think, haven't realized or they don't want to realize that they're being played.
Because that's absolutely right, because they take what they're told at face value. And that you have to dig deeper, which is what we're doing. You have to go into the substructure of this stuff. And for the absolute key to realize is that environmentalism is an ideology. And when I talk about global warming, I'm just writing a piece. I talk about global warming as an idea, not the physics of the greenhouse effect, but as it is an idea which is the most powerful component of an ideology, which is global warming, and it's been weaponized. I mean, it's the spearhead of an ideology, and that's the way that. And as you suggest, companies have absolutely no idea. They don't see it at all, which is why they get eaten every time. Every time.
And I think part of it is also, they have these sustainability people in the company, and then they have their PR people who are like, okay, you have to watch out because if you do this or that, the environmentalists will chain themselves to your door and you'll be in trouble. Yeah. And they're so timorous that they won't say, you know what, that's ridiculous. We're providing an amazing service to humanity and you have to back off. And they don't. They just.
Yeah, I think it's to my mind, is extraordinary that hydrocarbon companies have allowed themselves to be painted as like tobacco companies.
That's right.
It's absolutely extraordinary that they have the lack of belief in the good that they are doing. And that's why you mentioned Alex Epstein. It's absolutely the moral case, and they won't make it. There are one or two who do, but and they tend to be from smaller companies. But the oil majors, on the whole, are basically, they feel guilt about what they do. They stand up and say, no, what we do is benefiting humanity, and we're proud of what we do.
That's right. And I think the public would really respond to that, regardless of what the reactionary environmentalists, of course, would try to spin the narrative another way and do whatever. But I think it's important that they try to defend themselves, and I don't see it. And it's for the reasons that you mentioned and we've talked about. So I don't know what the way forward is for the companies to say, you should really make the case for the benefits that you provide.
Yeah, I think what's happening to Shell is a warning to them that the combination of net zero and the courts, this Dutch court ruling, basically will put them out of business. Over time, they are going to be sunsetted. and that's a very big thing. And I think the American ones in particular are going to say, well, actually, this isn't for us. We owe duty to society and to our shareholders, to our employees, and to our business. We're proud of what we do, and we're going to keep going. So I think that might change things.
I don't know if they'll be allowed to if they make the ESG scores based on the TCFD requirements or whatever mandatory. Because if it's mandatory, and then if you're penalized in some way because of whatever emissions you have in your production and your supply chain, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's been, for the first time, I've seen some pushback on, I think some of the oil companies or the API had a pushback on some of the proposals being made. So I think the penny is dropping that they are the next on the menu, the crocodile's menu. They're next on the list. And they're thinking, well, perhaps we don't want to be chewed up by the green crocodile.
Well, I think I was reading Mark Morano's book, Green Fraud, and he makes a compelling case that when you start to concede some of the main points of your opponent, you've lost. And if the oil companies concede that, okay, maybe there should be some ESG stuff, we just don't like all the stuff you've included, then I think that becomes a slippery slope for bringing in other things. You might get that concession at the onset, but now they've gotten you to agree that they should be able to have these ESG scores.
Yeah, the big ones, the climate disclosures, and that's so-called climate disclosures, which are, and they aren't disclosures. They are, as Carney suggests, it's about managing them down, forcing them down. Which all it will do is and there was a very important article in Foreign Policy by Jason Bordoff, who was the climate expert on the Obama administration's National Security Council, where he said, well, this is just going to push production to either privately owned companies or to state-owned companies. That you have to reduce demand. If you don't reduce demand, all you're doing is just changing who produces the hydrocarbons. And that's fundamentally true. It's very difficult to argue against that. And I think that realization is dawning. I think there's another thing about people like Mark Carney going for net zero, which I think is really bad, which is that Mark Carney recognizes that no company can operate at net zero, so they need to buy offsets, and he has positioned himself in the offset market to benefit from that. So what you have is financiers seeing a huge opportunity, essentially, to become private tax collectors.
Yeah,
and huge flows of net of carbon offsets and credits and so forth flowing through Wall Street. So there's a big, people like Mark Carney got a big self-interest in this stuff.
Yeah, so coming from a neo-Marxist like Carney, it's rather hypocritical, of course. But so talking about net zero, one of the things I noticed is that there's a real lack of honesty on what it means and where it takes us. And I think net zero is a term that few people understand what it means. It's spoken with such vagueness that it's left to a person's imagination as to what it actually means, which is really convenient for a controversial policy shift. If people understood what it really meant to their way of life and what it'll mean for how they live, I think they would say no. And they're just so dishonest. I think there's two pathways that are circulating, at least two. And the first one to the public is that, you know what, you can keep your car, you might pay a little more for stuff, but it won't be so bad. You'll still have your house and all these other things. And it's sold as this just going to replace one type of energy with another. It's fine. Everything will go on. But then the academics and the foundations and the institutes, they're saying something else. They're saying, no, we have to reduce car demand overall, even electric vehicles. Not everyone will get a car. You'll have to be biking or walking or taking transit or ride sharing or something like that. Um, and they're saying stuff like there's not going to be enough electricity, so we'll have to get used to rotating blackouts. And we're going to have to encourage a plant-based diet, meat as a treat, like they talk about in the EU. You won't own anything, you'll rent it. Like we had, I don't know if you saw in the news this week here in the UK, where they were featuring Boris's new wife and how she rents her clothes. And then they had a huge article on all the other things that you could rent or lease and how amazing that would be and change your lifestyle. And so people are being told one thing, but the actual pathway is something else.
No, that's very so. Politicians are saying this won't affect how much you earn, what you can spend your money on, your living standards, and so forth. And on the other hand, the IPCC is saying requires systemic transformation, societal transformation, so forth. And these are completely incompatible, and there is a vast dishonesty. I think when it comes to the public, I think which of them knows what carbon dioxide is? I mean, if you so that the level of comprehension of this and is very very limited. And there was a poll which the GWPF did a poll, and I think over 50% of young people thought that temperatures had risen since the Industrial Revolution risen. I think off from memory it's something like over 50% thought the temperatures had risen by 5 degrees or more. And so the ignorance of the problem, the supposed problem, is very, very great. And in a way, the environmental movement trades on that. So it can hype up the dangers because people don't understand. People just don't understand.
Yes. And I think you wrote an article recently about the youth and why aren't they more upset about what's being proposed, because it'll affect the youth the most. I mean, they'll no longer be able to have the kind of lifestyle they've been living. They're going to be the true inheritors of this. And one of the things that I've written about is how, like, Franz Timmermans last year at a Recovery Summit webinar he said it's important that we weaponize the youth, that they're a weapon.
Yes.
Which I thought was just, he's within his happy crowd and he's making these statements. And if you look at how, for example, there was an article this week about educators in the UK and how should they teach climate change and global warming in schools. And they were talking about in the primary school that they should be promoting activism, getting the kids out on the street.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, if someone on the conservative side or someone who was opposed to this environmental ideology were to hold a rally with children and skipping school, there would be just media coverage about how you were torturing your children and using them for political gain.
Yes, that's how. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely the whole nature of climate propaganda is and it is young people who they're being used, and they're the biggest losers, and it's very sad. And one doesn't see them piercing the veil of dishonesty of thinking for themselves, of skepticism or whatever. They just kind of, because it's being done in their name, is, if you like, the kind of, it's like that's what the drug pusher, the drug dealers are offering. It's being done in your name. We're doing it to save you, and of course they are going to be the biggest losers from this, far and away the biggest losers. They will not be gainers from climate policy. They will not experience net climate benefit.
No, and I think part of the thing in the schools is to get the kids to voluntarily accept it. Right? Pushing the idea that they're saving the planet, they have to do this. And in the article you mentioned how that there's the potential for this generational conflict, and you were a bit surprised on why it hasn't emerged yet. But I think that's coming. Perhaps once some of the reality sinks in on what this future holds, maybe that generational conflict will rear its ugly head.
Yeah, I do. I mean, very difficult to predict the future, but all one can say is it hasn't happened yet, and there are very few signs of it happening. I think eventually reality intrudes, and in what form, difficult to know. Boilers is one, central heating, decarbonising home heating. That's going to be a big problem. But how this construct breaks down when it hits reality, and what reality it will hit, remains to be seen.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's one of the most problematic aspects, is that a lot of people I talk to say, well, reality will hit, but when and how much damage will be done before it hits? And is there a way to sort of head this off, educate people, which I find extremely difficult because of the way the media operates, that
Yes.
if you try to speak out, you're deplatformed or whatever, or vilified or smeared, or the whole gamut of things if you have an unpopular opinion. And I liked your example in Green Tyranny about the spiral of silence, which dovetails with Peter Foster's idea of taboo. So, everyone's afraid, okay, what's everyone else thinking? How should I think about stuff? I don't want to be the odd one out. But then there's things that are taboo that you're not allowed to talk about. And so then you don't know if other people think these things too.
Yeah. I think I think there will be some changes, as if politicians articulate the other side, that helps break the spiral of silence. I think the other thing that helps it is what we're doing now, which is to understand. The first step is understanding the nature of the problem. I mean, by that is what we're up against, and understanding that environmentalism is an ideology that is using global warming for an ideological agenda, and that is the first step and then the various bits fall into place. But reaching that understanding, discussing, and so forth, is really important. And in Americans have this thing about, oh, you're only preaching to the choir. Well, I think what the spiral of silence that shows, and the book, it was written by a West German pollster, Elisabeth Noella Neumann, is that actually having a choir is really important.
That's an excellent point, because I hear that too. Is like, well, you're preaching to the choir, but if the choir doesn't realize they're members of a choir, and that there's other people there who are supportive and understand and working together, then I think that's why I'm doing this, to try and get the word out there, and so we understand the problem, and then can figure out how to push back and maybe change this trajectory that we're on. One of the things that concerns me is that there's this real rapid push to have things by 2030. And I was talking to some people who do work on the solar minimum. And there's the potential that we could be entering one of these minimum solar activity cycles, which is scheduled, what they think or they've calculated could be between 2030 and 2040, that it really takes hold. So suddenly temperatures drop because the solar output has decreased. And then we will have pushed through a bunch of policies over the past 8 years or so. And then the environmentalists will say, see, look, it worked. We should do more.
Yeah, I don't think that's a winner. That'll be a winner for them, because what people have experienced is cold weather and higher heating bills. I think that's. I think that might be one of the realities, if indeed temperatures do fall, and I have no way of knowing.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, it's another model.
But I mean, you always see, there's snowfall late in late spring, where they say that's caused by global. And I think at some level, people must think, well, that just doesn't stack up. I mean, which it doesn't stack up. I mean, climate's not weather, or that more global warming causes more precipitation, and there's all the polar vortex and stuff like that.
In your book, Green Tyranny, you talk about the 2009 conference in Essen, Germany, the Great Transformation Conference. And because
Yes.
if we're talking about this as being a system change and not climate change, I think that's a good place to start. I mean, they had been building up, towards that. And I think they thought that the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 was this amazing opportunity to try and get this global Green New Deal going and to do this transformation, and things kind of fell out from there. And you cite a Canadian political scientist, Thomas Homer Dixon, where he talked about there needed to be this culture shift. And I think that's what we've been seeing with the youth and the media, that there's been this relentless propagandizing about all of these things, because ClimateGate happened that year too. And ClimateGate just kind of vanishes. And any of the scientists who were pushing back against the narrative were really sidelined and pushed out, so that we can get this idea of consensus science and everything. So then by doing that and saying we have to follow the science and all this other stuff, it's this relentless push of creating the narrative, creating this cultural thing. You see it in television shows where they mention climate change all the time. You have David Attenborough doing his thing. And so it's just this drip, drip, drip. And it's relentless because it's a little bits everywhere add up.
Yes, and there's no countervailing pushback. Again, I mean, that's how the spiral of silence works, essentially.
Right.
It tries to marginalize and silence and remove from mainstream discourse questioning of about any questioning of the tenets of global warming. That's absolutely right.
One of the things, and I'm dwelling a little bit upon this man, but Thomas Homer Dixon also wrote a piece after the conference in 2015, where he talked about the potential for a synchronous failure in order to collapse the current capitalist system. And the hypothesis that was put forward, he co-wrote this with several people. The hypothesis put forward was that you could do this, you could create this synchronous failure if you could kneecap the hydrocarbon industry. If you could take it out, if you could take out the keystone, everything else will fall apart, because they went and they did this sort of mapping project where they looked at what ties everything together in the global system. And they came to the conclusion that it's hydrocarbons, it's particularly petroleum. So if you could kneecap it, you could have the whole system fail. So then he's gone on. In 2020 was the first year. He's the director of a new institute in Canada called the Cascade Institute. And you'd think Cascade, oh, that sounds maybe like it's some mountains or something. No, it's to create a cascade effect in the world. And they produced a study in December. And I just want to quote what he said and get your reaction. And I quote, "A global depression would create unfathomable hardship." And he's talking about what could come out of COVID. "But it could also create opportunities to redesign global economic institutions and their underlying doctrines to meet the worsening challenges of inequality, climate change, and pervasive economic insecurity." End quote. And he talked about the Rubini cascade, about heading into a new Great Depression. So the raison d'etre of this institute is to advocate for and help contribute to a cascade collapse of our system.
That is absolutely fascinating. I mean, that's really, really interesting. Very, very interesting. Quite shocking that you have academics really wanting to plot the downfall of our society, which is what they're doing. And people need to know about that.
Well, and in some ways they're in the open. if you go to the Cascade Institute website, it says it right there on the front that this is what they're doing. And it's at a university. It's at Royal Roads University on Vancouver Island, and
How lovely.
it's a beautiful setting. And he's got a group of people who work with, I think, at University of Waterloo, and then they're connected with Project Syndicate, which is connected to the Open Society, and all these different things. They get foundation funding, they get government funding, and
Amazing.
it's
Yeah, amazing.
amazing and unreal at the same time. I think I just had one other thing I wanted to say or ask you, and that's I think with respect to the petroleum industry and a lot of the businesses, is they think these are just rule changes, that somehow they just need to adapt. The game is still the same, but they just have to adapt to these new rules. And I don't think they understand that this is, like we've said, a system change. This isn't about changing rules. It's about changing the whole game, the whole system.
Yeah, I think that, I think on the one hand, if we're talking about oil companies, on the one hand, there's a part of them that knows that demand for oil and petroleum products will continue for the foreseeable future. So they think that's okay. And I think that means that they don't see the existential threat from NGOs and regulation and etc., who essentially want to put them out of business. And so
Right.
that they'll be driven out of business, but the state-owned petroleum companies will just pick up their market share. So, but I think in a way it might be becoming clearer. It might become, because, if you think of the 2020 election and Biden saying he didn't want to, well, he gave out such mixed messages, but since then, I mean, the embrace of net zero and the carbon disclosure stuff, I mean, the penny should be dropping.
Well, even if it's possible to stop this assault, I think our system needs to be restored to its original core principles. Ben Shapiro had a really good description of what's been happening to our system and as it currently stands after decades of attack. And I'm quoting him here where he says, it's stacking social programs atop a capitalist infrastructure. And I think that infrastructure is beginning to collapse, which is the goal, right? The goal of these people is to collapse that infrastructure. But how do we get rid of all that socialist programming that's been piled on?
I would actually, I would just change what he says a little bit, because I think it's happening from the inside of capitalism. And it's that on my ESG paper, I quote Joseph Schumpeter, the great Austrian-American economist, who foresaw capitalism turning into socialism. And in that book, he wrote Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy. He described the publicly owned corporation as capitalism's vulnerable fortresses, because there isn't, he talked about dematerialized ownership, that the shareholders are remote from the business and they don't come to the business's defense. And in fact, you've got shareholders in the oil companies who are their state pension funds from California and New York. And then you've got the index trackers like Vanguard and BlackRock. And it's a process that's happening within capitalism rather than being laid on the top. But the overall take is absolutely right. This is a huge threat to capitalism and therefore to prosperity.
Exactly. You refer to it, I think, as insider capitalism. Did you remember that right?
Yes.
Is it still capitalism if they're if they're acting like that? I don't know.
No, it isn't. It's evolved into something else. I mean, what I was taking from Larry Fink, who talked about he talked about inclusive capitalism, inclusive sustainable capitalism, but it's exclusive insider. when you have a handful of Wall Street billionaires, some foundations, the bosses of these state pension funds, essentially making decisions that affect the whole of society. And they're not voted on, they're not accountable to voters, they're not accountable really to their beneficiaries, to the fund beneficiaries either. So no, it's a huge threat.
Well, given what you've researched about the Nazi roots and whatnot, I mean, do you see this as a form of sort of corporatism or fascism? I mean, it seems to have fascist elements to it, as how this environmentalism as an ideology, how do they actually structure it? It seems rather fascist.
Well, I would not go, I'll tell you, because I think it's something new. I don't think it's something that I think what we're seeing is something sort of unprecedented. And I don't think those models from the 1920s and 1930s actually, I mean, what you have is you have the politicization of business, and the people controlling it it's not like there's a totalitarian party that's running the state, that's pulling the strings. It's much more, as we, going back to what we talked about, the climate industrial complex. It's much more subtle. It's less tangible. It's an ideology, a fairly amorphous ideology. But what one's talking about is this essence of capitalism will have been replaced by something else. And in my view, it's something completely new, and something very negative, because it will produce less than capitalism produces. It will have less legitimacy. It will see the hollowing out of job opportunities, social mobility, the middle class, the upper, if you like, the blue collar. But what we talked before, I think
Right.
it will be the world we'll be living in will be a worse world than the one we're living in today. Of that, I have no doubt.
That's a very good point to make because maybe that's why it's defying explanation, because it is this unprecedented something new that we're not even sure what form it will take in the end. We have all these examples from the past, and if it's something new,
Yeah, I mean, Joel Kotkin, I mean, part of it is neo-feudalism. I mean, it's a
right.
neo something. So, but it doesn't really that doesn't conform to the whole thing. Doesn't conform to, you can't sort of put something out off the historical shelf and that's what it'll be like. It'll be something new, but something far worse than what we have at the present.
Yes, absolutely. Um, if you have time, I just have one more thing I want to run by you.
Sure.
Um, I was thinking about how everything that the environmentalism as an ideology, what they've been putting forward, it's it's not just doublespeak. There's an inversion there, and I was thinking in particular of the Terra Carta and how that was an absurd and insulting inversion of the Magna Carta. And then there's this new Atlantic Charter that the G7 came out with, which is a risible affront to the original Atlantic Charter. And if this is an example of the type of framing of reimagined global institutions they're talking about, then I'm a little worried about what that
Yeah,
would.
I think what this shows is that the those governing us, it just shows a terrible lack of seriousness. Because who is the big who is the big winner for this? From this, it's certainly not the West. The big winner is Beijing,
Yeah.
essentially, where they see these muddle-headed Western leaders coming out with this kind of. You're absolutely. It's an inversion. It's kind of drivel. It's not dealing with the things as they are. And geopolitics, one of the things that, if one's looking at the rise of global warming from 1988, June 1988, when it kind of came onto the world stage, it was at the end of the Cold War. Geopolitical tensions were easing. We're now seeing the rise of geopolitical tensions. principally that between the United States and China. If the West is consumed with thinks that global warming is the existential threat and everything else must be sacrificed to that end, there is only one winner from that, and that is it's not a friend of the West who's going to be the winner from it. So yes, I think global warming is an existential threat, but it's not in the way that environmentalists have it. It's to the survival of the West as the most important power block in the world.
You're absolutely right. Like, it bothers me so much when I hear how people don't want to address that elephant in the room of who benefits the most. It's China. If you're talking about national security, which never seems to enter the arguments for why we're doing this, or a consideration of, is it wise to go to 100% renewables? How are you going to run your military? And when you have NATO making ridiculous comments about having like a solar tank, which is just, I mean, Beijing and Russia are just laughing. And I think what's even more problematic is,
well, what they'll do is they'll start a war in the middle of the night or something. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, just too insane.
yes. And I'm looking also, I'll be talking next week with someone about the role of China and in all of this. And I think of how they're making these agreements with Russia in the Arctic. And Russia has their fleet of nuclear icebreakers, and they're developing various Arctic petroleum fields and building pipelines to Europe and building pipelines to China. And we're stopping it. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Great pleasure, Tammy. Really good questions, a really good conversation. It's always great talking to other knowledgeable people in the field because I learn as much as you learn, and it's really good.
Yes, thank you. That's what I love about conversations.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and I can't wait to read your next piece on Real Clear Energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tammy.